Hello, everyone. Excuse me. All right, folks, are you able to hear me okay? Okay, cool. So today I'm actually going to turn this down a little bit. Today we're going to be looking at no lectures. Yeah, that's okay. I mean, really, this has been mostly review stuff. So although I'm lecturing, it's really just stuff that you guys have already heard before. But I think it's the most important way to use our time before you guys take the actual AP exam, because it's good to review this stuff. And since we got to where we needed to be in terms of the content that you'll actually be asked questions on, I figure it's probably good to just spend time reviewing, and then after you guys take the AP exam, from then until the end of the school year, which, by the way, the AP exam is now, I think they changed the date of it, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see here. Yeah, it's a week later now. So the AP exam for AP Euro is now on Wednesday, May 13. So we have a little bit more time here to discuss, um, age of, well, the isms unit, and then age of realpolitik, and then German Italian unification, and then age of mass politics. So that will round out the review, and then after the review, then I can either teach you guys new stuff, or I can assign other work that. But I think the plan is that we're going to move into talking a little bit about World War I, which is where we left off. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and then maybe just do a brief, like basically almost like a review session, but for the last several units of the class, where I can talk to you guys about kind of some of the stuff that happens in the 20th century. Yeah, um, yeah, that definitely, Renee. Yeah, I do want to teach more stuff. That's basically the plan coming up after you guys take the AP exam on the 13th. Um, I'll be, um, you know, talking a little bit about each of the units that I didn't get a chance to talk about for the end of the school year, to give you some idea about, the 20th century, basically. So today's lecture is on the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to be reviewing that today. And I have a number of notes that I have pulled up here that I'm going to use to review. We went extensively into the Industrial Revolution right at the start of the year when you guys were doing your CERT projects. The start of 2020, that is. And let's see here. I'm going to pull this up over on... Actually, I wonder if I can open this up in here. Nope. For whatever reason, it does not like opening that up. Let's do this here. Let's go back to Schoology really quick. That way I can see it. Just got to go over here, group, AP Euro. And then we got to find Industrial Revolution. So much stuff. Okay, very good. So yeah, I apologize for on Friday. I got an email on Wednesday actually, and the email basically said like just Norco colleges being abundantly cautious about online instruction, and it was really frustrating, to be honest with you, because I don't. I mean, I know how to use Canvas. I just don't prefer Canvas in terms of its layout. I find it to be unnecessarily complicated. And I like how simple and straightforward Schoology is, and the layout of it. It's nice. I can message you guys very easily on Schoology. It has an app that's really user friendly. I just prefer Schoology, but I got this email from the powers that be at the college, the dean of instruction actually, saying like you're out of compliance, you need to be using Canvas, which is dumb because of course the whole class was already set up on Schoology, which allowed me to seamlessly continue teaching it probably better than most instructors. But that's not the point. The point is that when your boss tells you to do something, you got to do it. And so on Thursday and Friday, I had to spend basically my whole day, both of those days, migrating my entire college course from Schoology over to Canvas. So now I have to do my instruction through Canvas on the college class. But anyhow, we're going to stick with Schoology for Euro because it's so much nicer, and I have as much stuff as I have for the college. I have even more for Euro that I would have to transfer over. So that is why Friday I needed to take that day to work. They needed it done by May 1st. That's why it had to be done then. So anyhow, let's go ahead and start reviewing Industrial Revolution. So the big idea behind the Industrial Revolution is that machines begin to significantly replace human and animal power in producing stuff in Europe. And this starts actually with the Agricultural Revolution. So the Agricultural Revolution, which we sometimes talk about after Columbus, where you have the Columbian Exchange and a whole bunch of new materials or raw materials that are being grown or produced globally, where European empires have gone and set up colonies. We see a transition to a commercial style agriculture, but agricultural production remains the number one form of production in Europe all the way up until the Industrial Revolution. So when we talk about the Agricultural Revolution, what we're really talking about is that we're taking an agrarian society that was based on subsistence, growing stuff for local consumption, basically, or personal consumption, to growing stuff for the purpose of global trade, and producing stuff not just, previous to the Agricultural Revolution, stuff was produced on a local farm, and they only grew as much as they needed to be able to get through that year. And then too, remember, there isn't free trade at that time. We don't have a liberal capitalist economy yet in the 1700s. And so you're not able to just as a peasant be able to just grow a bunch of excess and then trade it on an open market as you would today. Let's say you wanted to open up, like today, a chicken farm in your, well, you can't do it in your backyard. There's legal codes about that. But if you wanted to open up a chicken farm, okay, you could get the permits and everything necessary to do that, and then just become a individual chicken farmer, and it wouldn't be a big deal. It would probably be hard. It'd be a lot of hard work, but you could do it. Back in those days, you can't just trade on an open market. You'd need permission from your local landlords, who would be the ones who own the land that you were producing stuff on anyway, so it wouldn't even be your stuff to sell. So that's kind of the big thing about the Agricultural Revolution, is we see a transition to a commercial style economy, but the commerce that's being conducted is being conducted, in England at least, by increasingly wealthy nobles who are purchasing up land and enclosing that land and pretty much the main thing that they want to do with that land is grow sheep on it, because sheep produce wool. And prior to the cotton gin being invented in 1793 or somewhere in there, 1791, 1793, the cotton gin comes around, Eli Whitney. Prior to that, wool is the number one thing that people make their clothing out of. So a lot of the early textile mills are actually making clothing that is wool clothing, not cotton clothing. It's not until we see the production of cotton skyrocket after the cotton gin that that textile mills transition to making cotton fabrics. Nonetheless, the agricultural revolution came with it a number of changes. New irrigation techniques, including being able to drain land, marshy swamplands, and the Dutch pioneered this. Cornelius Vermeulen, I believe, was the guy's name, and the English very quickly adopt these Dutch techniques. Elsewhere in Europe, you don't see as strong of an enclosure movement due to what we've talked about in class several times, which is that nobles back in the day in England were allowed to participate in commerce without giving up their noble title. But in many places across Europe, France included, they were not able to do this. If you wanted to become a noble, there were certain privileges that came along with being a noble, like not paying taxes and stuff, as we talked about with the French Revolution. However, one thing that you are not able to do in France is to continue to practice private commerce as a noble, because there are other expectations and privileges that you have in your position as a noble. So the agricultural revolution also saw the development of new techniques like crop rotation, which allowed for the soil to be used repeatedly year in, year out without draining the nutrients, because they learned that they didn't know this right away, but they learned that different crops supply nitrate to the soil and extract nitrites from the soil, and then others do the opposite. They supply nitrites and take away nitrates. And there are certain crops that people could grow, clover and other things. Good morning, Vig. Good to see you. There were certain things that would replenish the nutrients in the soil that would allow them to grow bountiful crops year in and year out. So crop rotation was a major aspect of the agricultural revolution, as well as we have new tools that are being used as well. And that is that's going to be looking at things like the seed drill by Jethro Tull and so on, that allowed for more rapid cultivation of the land, and ultimately fewer people to tend the land. Right? That's really the big thing about the agricultural revolution, is that you don't need as many people to tend the land. Now, meanwhile, speaking of people, we also are seeing significant population growth at this time. So all throughout the agricultural revolution, and then increasingly through the 18 and 1900s, when we get to the industrial revolution, the population of Earth, in particular in Europe, though, is skyrocketing, and the United States as well, actually, by this point. And this leads to an interesting new an interesting new issue, which is that you have a whole bunch of people. Good news is that food production is going up thanks to the agricultural revolution. So there is food for these people to eat, but then you enter into that question of Thomas Malthus, which is there going to be a point at which the population growth outstrips people's ability to continue to sustain them? Because there are only so many lands on Earth that are arable that you can grow crops on. And only some lands will grow some crops, right? So you can't just take cocoa beans and plan to plant them in, Minnesota or something like that. They're not going to grow. So land use, of course, continues to be a major feature of European society all the way through modern times, really. But the Europeans are fixated on how to use land and how to use it more efficiently. Now, of course, the Malthusian trap has never actually occurred. There are people out there who believe that we are still just not there yet, that the Earth's population will continue to grow, and that at one point we will not have enough food to feed people. I personally am not a neo-Malthusian. I think all the stats show that there's plenty of food on Earth. It's a distribution of wealth problem. There's plenty of food to go around, but there's a lot of food that is that doesn't make it into the mouths of people. Anyway, moving on to more stuff involving the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution begins to transition, and there's a period of time where we see something develop called Proto Industrialization. Now, Proto Industrialization is kind of a middle point. It's a transitionary period. It's not really full industrial revolution yet, but we're starting to see some changes, and this is sometimes also called cottage industry. So, basically, the rural population at this time is eager to supplement its income because increasingly they are finding themselves in a fragile economic position, right? And so they're looking to make more money, and so wealthier merchants in urban areas, in cities, who would buy and sell trade cloth primarily, started to look outside of the guild system inside cities. Now, if you remember the guild system, this was the master apprentice system that had been used in Europe going all the way back to the Middle Ages, where you had craftsmen who would produce different things literally by hand. And the way that they would produce these things would mean that each production is kind of a one-off deal. Okay, one-off production. What I mean by one-off is unlike this plastic remote control here, right? There is some nameless factory that in probably somewhere, maybe it even says on here. It does not say. But there's some factory on the planet somewhere who their whole production for that day is producing thousands and thousands and thousands of these little battery doors here, right? And each battery door is produced exactly the same way as the last, because they use a mold to produce this thing, right? And I used to work at a plastics factory making parts very similar to this. And this is not a one-off production. This is a mass-produced good, right? All are produced identically. They're using a mold to press this into the shape that it is, and every part comes out more or less exactly the same as the last. Now, in the olden days, in the guild system, they would produce a single pair of shoes that was handcrafted, and so you wouldn't easily be able to say purchase, like if the heel on the shoe got worn off, you'd have to go and have a custom new heel made for the shoe. And so one of the big changes that we see when we get to the Industrial Revolution is interchangeable parts, right? Where we see mass-produced goods where you're able to, if the exhaust pipe on your Ford Model T rusts out, all those exhaust pipes are produced exactly the same way, so you can just go and buy another fitment to replace the one that was in there. In a previous era, where you had custom-made wagons and stuff like that, maybe the axle from one is a 1/4 inch longer than the axle on another or something like that, and it doesn't quite fit right, and so you'd need to have it custom fitted to replace parts. So replaceable parts is a major or interchangeable parts is a major factor in the Industrial Revolution, as we move closer to it. But really, the point that I was trying to make is that the guild system starts to be undermined by local urban merchants who don't want to pay the guilds, which are highly regulated and very expensive to get things custom made and done by the guild system. They start supplementing income in a similar fashion to the way that on a smaller scale they would put their orders out to the surrounding countryside, where people would work for less money but produce more or less a equivalent quality good as the guild system was able to produce. Now, not everybody produced things as good as the guild system. Obviously, the guild system has master craftsmen in it who are very good at their craft, but we see the displacement of the guild system in favor of cheap labor in the rural surrounding countryside, and that was what we called cottage industry, where people would literally work in their little cottages on the surrounding countryside to supply the merchants inside cities, and that was the putting out system, or the cottage industry, or sometimes it's called Proto Industrialization. Oftentimes these merchant capitalist traders in urban areas would provide the raw materials like wool to a rural family, who would then produce finished or semi-finished products and then send that back to the merchant for payment. And they're usually produced by the number of pieces that they produced. Merchants would then sell that finished product for a profit. So the merchant operates as a middleman. Now, of course, companies do this today on a much larger scale by outsourcing their labor to places where they can have stuff produced much cheaper. So when you go to stores like H&M or really any clothing store or shoes or anything like that, most of that stuff is produced not here in the United States, but in places where labor is cheaper, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and places like that. So basically, this cottage industry is a family enterprise. You would have like 4 or 5 women oftentimes spinning yarn to be able to be put into, cloth textiles. And, there are some problems with it. Thousands of poor families are able to supplement their income, so that's good. But there are constant disputes between cottagers and merchants over the weights and materials of the quality of the cloth. Rural labor is difficult for merchants to control distantly because there's no supervision, and that's why we start to see factories, in-house factories where people show up to work in a designated location and perform wage labor for a period of time each day. Replace the cottage industry. Now, during the proto-industrial phase, we start to see new tools developed to help with the mass production of textiles. And so, for example, we see the flying shuttle, we see the spinning jenny, and we see the water frame, and even something else called the spinning mule, which kind of combines the best features of the spinning jenny and the water frame together. And this all results excuse me, this all results in the mass production of textiles. Now, as we remember from class back in the beginning of 2020, hello there, Christine. Sorry, I just saw your message right now. I'm kind of swapping between windows here. As we move into the industrial era, we remember back to the beginning of 2020 that England was the first country to industrialize, and this starts in the 1780s, but we really don't see full industrial production take place in a modern understanding of that word, like factory production, until about 1830. So that period of proto-industry lasts for probably a solid 50, 75 years, probably somewhere in that neighborhood. This just reminded me, actually, a side note. I was watching last night, as I often do, some weird videos on YouTube, and I watched an interview from a woman who was 108 years old, and she was being interviewed in the year 1977, which means that she grew up in the Victorian era in the late 1800s. And it was really interesting to hear how she talked about change of women's role in society, and how, back in the olden days, your options as a woman to become a professional were limited to school teacher. And when I say school teacher, I usually mean young kids, like grade school, okay, not really high school or college. Nurses, and then as you enter into the industrial era, urban working women could get jobs as like telephone operators and things like that. But she said to become a private business owner as a woman, and this is a woman who's 108 years old, right? I mean, she's surprisingly lucid, aware. I don't know what word I'm trying to use, but like she is not like senile or anything like that. She's surprisingly very descript in her experience in seeing things change for the role of women over the course of the century that she lived through. And it was really interesting that she basically said, like, there was no hope if you were a woman who wanted to start a private business. There was no hope of doing that. There was no women starting private businesses at even in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that shows you kind of the fragility of the position of women in society at that time. Now, of course, today, we certainly haven't figured all things out in terms of gender or racial or whatever other social issues that we deal with. But, as a woman today, if you wanted to start your own business or whatever, there's nothing that should stop you from doing that. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't certain systemic things in place, invisible barriers and other things like that, that could contribute. But generally speaking, it was really, really interesting to hear this woman's analysis of how things have changed for gender roles over the course of the time period that she lived in, from the late 1800s, probably about, oh God, what would that have been, 1881 or something like that? I'm not really good at math. 1977, so 100 years before that would be 1877. So she was born in, 1869. Okay, so she was really, really old. Holy smokes, I just realized that. So 1977, she was 108. Is that right? 1877 is 100 years before, 8 years before 1877. Yeah, is like 1869, 1870. Wow, that's, I'm not a math teacher, so I got to sit and really think in my head about things so I don't mess it up. But anyway, well, let's get back to the Industrial Revolution. I don't mean to just continue talking about things that are impertinent, but I think it's good to share that stuff because it's always interesting to hear. It's always to gain perspective on our modern times. The only way to understand how things have changed over time is to listen to people's testimony. Okay, so moving on to the Industrial Revolution. We are also seeing at this time during the Proto Industry increasingly more numbers of people moving from agricultural rural areas to urban areas, not really because they want to, but because they don't have a choice. People in England in particular at this time, which is where I'm focusing right now, people in England at this time think wage labor is basically one notch above slavery, and don't want to perform wage labor. They don't want to go and work in a factory. They don't want to perform work for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, or however long in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, because it sounds like a miserable existence, and it very much is. And so they don't really want to go and do that. They're not seeking out work because they want to. They're seeking out work because they have to, because we're seeing a new economy develop, a consumer-style economy, where people increasingly, as we enter into the industrial era, are supplying themselves not by producing the things that they need, like they did in an earlier time where they would produce clothing or food or whatever they needed. People oftentimes had relatively few possessions. because they don't have excess money to just be able to go and buy stuff. And even if they did have excess money to buy stuff, where would you buy it when there's not an economy of mass-produced goods for you to just be able to pull up Amazon and buy whatever you want and have it shipped to your house? That just doesn't, it's not a function of society back in that time. You can't just show up at your local Walmart and buy all the things that you need. So they had to produce it. And as we move into the Industrial Revolution, increasingly we're seeing people moving away from that production-style economy into a consumption-style economy, where you now have consumers who purchase things locally. Especially as urban areas grow, we see merchants inside cities opening up stores and things like that, where you can, you have your local butcher, you have your local tavern, you have your local, market where you would be able to buy all sorts of different wares. And so we start to see the rise of stores basically is I mean, it's not that you didn't have stores before, but you increasingly see more and more and more people who are working for money, and then they're using that money to support their survival, to purchase the things that they need. So we talked about some of the new tools that are being developed during this time. We talked that England is the first to industrialize. Let's talk about a few of the factors about creating an industrial economy. In order to create a capitalist industrial economy, really the first thing that you need is you need three things. You need land, you need labor, and you need capital. And I'm actually going to briefly switch over here to desktop view so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. Let's swap over here. Hopefully you guys can see this. Let's maximize this. Okay. So let's scroll down here. So here we go. Land, labor, capital. These are the three magic words to creating an industrial economy. But it's not enough just to know that it's land, labor, capital. You also need to know what about land, what about labor, and what about capital allowed Britain in particular to industrialize first. Well, first of all, they are geographically isolated from the continent, which offers protection from many of the continental wars that were going on during this time, which included, by the way, the French Revolutionary War is happening through all of this, right? You think we're talking about the 1790s. Don't forget, the French Revolution is in full swing in the 1790s. And then shortly thereafter, you have the Napoleonic Wars. But remember that England is largely protected from this because they are an island. And also, England has arable land that allowed them to be able to produce wool. For whatever reason, England was just really good at producing wool, and English wool was heavily sought after on the global market. And of course, they can produce other things as well. They have natural supplies of coal and iron, which was essential. So it's not just that they have land. Not every place that has land is going to be able to industrialize as quickly. You need the right kind of land. You need to have those natural deposits of coal and iron to be able to do that. They also have significant numbers of waterways that allow them to transport goods and use those waterways in the early days to power the factories using water mills. Remember that back in the olden days, they didn't have electricity, so they needed to use natural, and I use that word loosely because when I say natural, really, folks, that gives the connotation that somehow it's like green friendly or something like that. And frankly, it's not that green friendly, because there was a lot of pollution and abuse of land that took place in the name of the agricultural revolution and proto industrial eras. So they are using natural, quote unquote, ways of powering their factories. But I don't want to leave you with the impression like, oh, if we were to just resort back to doing things the olden ways, that suddenly global warming would be fixed or something like that, because that's certainly not the case. There'd be every bit as many problems. And if you look at photographs of the early Industrial Revolution, I think that it stands to show you that that pollution was a major, major problem. right from the get-go. And so anyhow, the Industrial Revolution grew out of England's expanding role in the Atlantic economy in the 18th century. And you see the growth of the Royal Navy at this time, the development of ports, and they have this massive merchant marine that it allows them to trade with all of their colonies globally. And remember, England has a lot of colonies. They have colonies in India, they have colonies in the Caribbean, they have colonies in Africa, they have colonies all over the place, and they're using these colonies to produce to produce raw materials so that they can mass produce goods back in England. So land, labor, capital. We talked about the labor side, people moving to cities, and then money, right? So there's that. What's going on here? How come this is lagging? Okay. I'm just going to keep it like this because sometimes it lags when I have it in full screen mode. So you need fewer farmers to feed large numbers of people at this time. British population is doubling in the 1700s. The demand for goods within the country increases, and people are now freer to move around in search of land or other forms of employment. Rural wage earners tend to be relatively mobile at that time. And then, too, remember that we see large supplies of capital are available after 2 centuries of profitable commercial activity by England in global trade. They establish the Bank of England, which is willing to give out loans to people. Insurance companies start to emerge during this time to particularly protect shipping, because shipping was a liability back in the olden days. If you had somebody who wasn't good at shipping, maybe the ship gets lost, maybe stuff gets damaged, and you wouldn't want to lose your investment. Entrepreneurs, we see highly motivated, inventive people who possess technological skill, and they're willing to take risks. This could be exemplified by, for example, James Watt, who came up with the improved steam engine, and so that's probably the best example of entrepreneurship. But there are other ones too. Gave Britain access to raw materials across the globe. That's a big part of the land as well, is that Britain doesn't have to grow everything that they're going to be producing in England. Their massive empire allows them to produce stuff in all sorts of climates around the world. The role of government. They have a pretty stable government at this time. The successful outcome of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars in particular, but even going back to the 7 Years' War, allowed Britain to be able to pass laws that promoted commerce and things. There was the rise of the House of Commons, which became an instrument of the middle class to gain cooperation and secure middle class loyalty. Because remember, the people who are serving in the House of Commons at that time, they are quote unquote middle class, but the middle class is still a relatively select group of society. There's not the middle class doesn't make up the vast majority of people. We're talking about a limited segment that has capital that is able to secure seats in Parliament and pass laws in their own interest to be able to continue to grow their own wealth. Moving down here a little bit, there was a growing demand for textiles, and this led to the creation of the first large factories in Europe. The steam engine, in particular the steam engine being applied to production, was probably the key event of the Industrial Revolution. In the 1780s, Richard Arkwright, who invented the water frame, started to use the steam engine to power the looms. And we see new industries flourish as they provide new machinery made out of iron and metal and other things. Coal, of course, is another aspect of this, where we see the coal industry develop significantly during this time. And that's, I was talking in class, if you remember, about that positive interference loop. The positive interference loop being that as more coal, the way that you get coal is you mine it out of the ground. These mines are in the ground, which means that in England, which is rainy a lot of the time, these mines fill up with water. So they needed the steam engine actually originally to pump the water out of the mine so that they could get more coal. But that itself leads to the creation of more steam engines, which leads to more coal mining, which leads to more steam engines, and so on. And then eventually, too, the same thing happens with the railroads, right, where we have this positive interference loop where more tracks are being built so that more trains can be built, so that more coal can be mined, so that more trains can run, so that more tracks can be laid, and so on and so forth. It feeds on itself. The same way that if I was to turn my mic up right now, or my speakers up rather, so right now I'm talking to you, but I can't hear myself speak through my speakers, because if I did, the speakers would then be picked up by the microphone, which would then feed that signal back to the speakers louder, and then louder, and then louder, and then louder, until it would start to feed back and sound really loud and miserable. Steam engines and coal, remember that before coal they used wood, but England had basically chopped down every single last tree there was in England to produce ships and other things like that, which is why back when they first settled in North America, one of the first things that they were looking for were vast forests so that they could continue to produce ships, because in order to build the mast of a ship, you need to have a really tall tree with a nice big straight trunk that you can use for the mast of the ship, and they didn't have those anymore in England. So coal increasingly starts to be used to power these industries, and by 1850, England produced 2/3 of the world's coal. There's James Watt, who invented the first efficient steam engine. He didn't technically invent the steam engine. He took another idea and improved upon it and made it a lot better, and this is the thing that allowed for the fundamental advance in technology that we see in the Industrial Revolution. Radical transformations occur during this time in both manufacturing and transportation, thanks to the steam engine being applied to trains, but also boats and so on. So we see steamships emerge and things. And then the iron industry is also radically transformed by steam power. We see, Henry Cort developed the puddling furnace, which allowed pig iron to be refined into wrought iron with coke. And Cort also developed the heavy-duty steam-powered rolling mills capable of shaping finished iron into any shape or form, and that is what wrought iron is you can take and shape the iron. And by 1850, England produced more than half of the world's iron as well. So England is really has a couple of very key advantages that allowed them to industrialize, just by way of the fact that they had coal and iron ore mines. Then, of course, we see, like I said, transportation revolution. We see the starting of building of canals to connect waterways together so that they can continue to produce goods and trade them over long distances in England, because remember, land travel back in those days is difficult. But it's going to become increasingly easier as railroads are laid down to connect different places together. Originally, railroads were kind of meant to just basically bring heavy loads of coal and iron to wherever they needed to go to. So they were just like a single line, almost like the same way like the monorail is a single line at Disneyland. But then increasingly we see the tracks start to connect together to create a spider web of tracks across the country that allow for mass transit of goods and people too. And remember that the transportation industry also has some other kind of effects that maybe people didn't originally see happening with it, but we start to see a growing, increasingly as railroads get built throughout the 1800s. By the time that we get to, say, the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, there are a lot of railroads across England, and people increasingly are starting to use those railroads for leisure activities. Also, their diets improve because we're seeing food that previously would spoil if it was tried to be transported distances across land in England. They can get it there much faster now. So people's diets improve. So people inland can eat fish, fresh fish from the coast, and things like that. So The other thing is it brings down shipping costs too, because the more available shipping is, the demand for it remains very, very high. But because there are more and more lines, the supply of the amount of transportation also grows. And because the supply grows so much, meaning that there are more and more and more tracks being laid for railroads, but then eventually even just regular roads where they would use automobiles and things, trucks, to transport goods. But at first, railroads, the supply of railroads goes up, which means that the price of transporting stuff on those railroads comes down. Okay, Britain in 1850, I said already, 2/3 of the world coal, half of the world's iron, more than half of the world's cotton cloth by 1850, because remember, by then we have the cotton gin. They're getting a lot of that cotton cloth by trading with the United States at that time, who is supplying most of the world's raw cotton. 90% of the GDP of the United States at that time was cotton growth. Was it 90? No, maybe not quite 90. It was a huge amount, though. It was well over 50%. I don't know if it was 90. I might be wrong on that number. But there was a huge portion of the United States economy that was devoted almost exclusively to cotton production. And it's hugely profitable for America. Per capita income increases during this time as well. You might think that because people's lives are so miserable working in these factories that their incomes would have somehow either stayed the same or gone down, but actually their incomes increased by almost 100%. But you got to remember that's in part because people made so little money beforehand. So doubling their income is awesome. It's great. I would love if my income was doubled inside of 50 years, which I guess it could happen. I don't know that it will, but like, that's pretty good. However, keep in mind, well, hello there, Harrison. How are you? Harrison just reached up and touched my arm because he wanted to get pet here. Hi there. So, anyhow, let's see. What was I saying? Okay. But here's the thing about that. While their income is growing, you still have to understand these folks have really hard lives, and they do have more money to spend on things, and some people are able to take pleasure trips on the weekend out to the coast or something like that. But the fact of the matter is that, like, it's not like they're really particularly wealthy or anything like that. Most people still have, by modern day understandings, extremely low quality of life, and very, very difficult lives. Now, continental Europe, due to the Napoleonic Wars, really doesn't start to industrialize until after Napoleon is vanquished at the Battle of Waterloo. So continental Europe lags behind a bit in terms of... Come here, buddy. Harrison is not leaving me alone. He wants some attention here, so I got to pick him up and hold him for a little bit until he gets sick of it, and then I'll let him go. All right. Continental Europe doesn't begin to industrialize until a little bit later. Parts of the continent are not far behind. The first country on the continent, on the European continent, to be able to produce stuff is Belgium, and then the Netherlands and so on follow shortly thereafter. France, Germany. But remember that the trend of industrialization moves from England outwards, almost as if you were to throw a stone into a pond, right? A stone into a pond means that those ripples from that stone are going to spread out from where it's all started, right? And so it's going to take longer, farther away from where you threw the stone, for the ripples in the pond to reach that location. And so when we think in Europe, if the stone is thrown into England, it's going to take a while for those ripples to reach, say, Italy or the Balkans, Southeast Europe, like Romania or Hungary or places like that, or even further east, Russia. So industrialization, the pattern is from from north to south and from west to east across Europe. Talked about that. By 1815, much okay, lag behind, shortage of factory workers. Remember that in the rest of Europe too, that they didn't have the same kinds of practices that they had in England. And so, can you see Harrison? Oh, yeah, sure. Hang on one second. I gotta switch this back. Come here, buddy. Here's Harrison. He's very sweet. How you doing, buddy? How you doing? You looking for more food? Look at how fat he is. He's a big boy. All right. Let's continue here. Okay, so after 1815, continental Europe starts to catch up a little bit. But remember, they didn't have some of the practices in England, so there wasn't a huge enclosure movement in France in the same way that there was in England. There's some enclosures built, but a lot of those closures get undone during the French Revolution. Now, industrialization kind of differs in each country after 1815. Belgium, Holland, which is the Dutch Republic, France, and the United States began their industrial revolution more or less in the second decade of the 19th century. We do see some of the same kinds of changes occur in America. Remember Samuel Slater, the trader, who brought over all of the industrial inventions, the machines that allowed England to industrialize. He brings them over to the United States, and they are able to very quickly industrialize in their economy as well. We don't see a national bank really develop in France until later, though, the Credit Mobilier being the most famous one in the 1850s under Napoleon III. Britain was unsuccessful in maintaining a monopoly on technological advances, and eventually they very quickly spread across the rest of Europe. There was a German tariff on non-German imports called the Zollverein that allowed them to protect some German industries and encourage capital investment in German stuff. So that Zollverein was a tariff on non-German goods. So Germany allows for their own domestic production to flourish during that Zollverein period of time. And they established a free trade zone among the member states of that Zollverein, and a single uniform tariff was levied against foreign countries so that people would not buy foreign goods but instead would buy German-made goods. And of course this increases in German production, and Germany eventually eclipses Britain by the time that we get to about the 1870s in their industrial production. In terms of social implications of the Industrial Revolution, we see traditional social hierarchy based on feudalism that starts to be replaced with a brand new social hierarchy based on wealth accumulation. And so increasingly the role of nobles is being undermined, or we're seeing the old order of the European economy completely overhauled, and the what's going on here? I keep getting dings on my phone. Okay, so the overhaul of the social hierarchy means that nobles are no longer going to be able to hold on to their exclusive position in society. And more and more and more, you have wealthy capitalists who are going to be getting into positions of power in England, in the House of Commons, and create laws that benefit merchant capitalism. So this is the bourgeois class, right? The bourgeoisie. There's kind of two levels of bourgeoisie. The upper bourgeois, which is going to be your great bankers, great merchants, great industrialized who demand free enterprise. Then you have what's called your petite bourgeoisie, which is your lower bourgeois class. Those are going to be smaller industrialists, smaller merchants, professional men who demanded stability and security from the government. And then you have new opportunities for certain groups that emerge. Artisans and skilled workers who are highly talented achieve significant success in a lot of cases because they're able to design things that allow for high quality production goods to be made. But also, you got to remember that on the vast majority of the labor class in Europe at this time becomes de-skillified. In other words, one of the major aspects of the Industrial Revolution is that when people go and seek out these wage labor jobs in factories, the skills that they have go away because you don't need to know how to build a whole shoe to work in a shoe factory. You only need to know how to do your one small part of whatever, sewing the stitching on the side of it using a sewing machine, and that's your one part, and you send it down the assembly line, and you never really get the whole idea of how to build a shoe. And so people, the de-skillification of the labor class results in a lot of people who really don't have any skills whatsoever. Any monkey could go up and do the same job more or less. It's an effect that has repercussions, right? Because you have a greater number of people in society who really don't know how to do stuff other than wage labor, which is kind of sad if you think about it, because wage labor is important and it makes all of our lives great here in Southern California, but it certainly makes, for every one person on the planet whose life merchant capitalism makes great, there's probably 10 other people whose backs the labor came on. And so, that's kind of one of the functions of the de-skillification of the labor class. You have a whole lot of people who don't really have an education and who don't have many opportunities outside of working 14 hours a day in a sweatshop. Factory workers emerge as a new group in society. The proletariat is sometimes what the working class is referred to. So this is where we start to see the development of the ideology of Marx, who said that there would be a class war between the bourgeois class and the proletariat. Poorhouses emerge to provide work to those people who are unemployed. So even if you were unemployed, you could end up in the poorhouse, which is the last place that you wanted to end up because the conditions in the poorhouse were abysmal and intentionally oppressive. And the idea is you don't want to stay there, so they would intentionally make the poorhouses miserable so that you would try and leave and find work elsewhere. I just talked about that. Friedrich Engels lashed out at the middle classes, the bourgeois class, in the condition of the working class in England in 1844. And he is a future revolutionary along with the colleague Karl Marx, who believed that capitalist middle class ruthlessly exploited the proletariat. And that's where we start to see the development of the Communist Manifesto. The issues of working conditions, wages, and quality of life led to struggles between labor and capital, in other words, workers and wealthy. For workers and ordinary families, the long-term impact of the Industrial Revolution was probably more favorable than negative, because in the long term, improvements do get made. And that was one of the things that Karl Marx didn't really foresee, which is that governments increasingly, as you guys know, would become more democratic as we enter into the mid-19th century. So by the time that we get to 1850, 1860, 1870, we're seeing increasingly governments, but even particularly England's government, experimenting more and more and more with widening suffrage and allowing more people to participate in voting for parliamentary members and so on. And when those people get voted into office, they do end up making laws that reform business practices that make their lives less oppressive. So over time, workers eat better, the quantity and quality of their clothing improves. Now, housing does not really improve for working people. In fact, it may have deteriorated because as these urban areas grow, they didn't have a lot of planning that went into it. And so we see a lot of problems emerge in urban areas where you have urban blight and crime and other things that emerge, pollution and I mean not only pollution in the sense that people throw their trash and excrement and animal entrails and other things like that onto the streets, but they also, you have vermin that attracts, and it spreads disease. But you also have the coal pollution, where you have coal smoke spewing into the air at all times, and so it's really miserable. You might remember that we read in class the piece from Alexis de Tocqueville, the French, social critique, who went to England and traveled through Manchester and described how, on one hand, it's humanity's highest level of achievement, and on the other hand, humanity is reduced to nothing more than a cog in the industrial machine, and the misery that it really brought in 1830, in the early days of industrialization, how miserable the living conditions were. Until 1850, workers as a whole really didn't share in the general wealth produced by the Industrial Revolution, but afterwards, after 1850, is when we really start to see things change. You do have a group of Luddites. The early Luddites are a group of violent, irate workers who blamed industrialization for threatening their jobs. Beginning in 1812 and continuing thereafter, they started to go into factories in northern England to destroy the new machines they thought that were putting them out of work. And we eventually start to see the development of unions. But remember that unions, the Combination Acts, had prohibited labor unions from being developed in the early days. And this meant that workers could not combine into groups to advocate for, better working conditions, living conditions, and so on, pay, fewer hours, etc. And those are the kinds of things that unions ultimately will end up fighting for. But remember, in the early days, that the Combination Acts in most places across the planet, when industrialization first starts, workers are not allowed to just combine into unions and bargain for better lives, better quality of lives. Let's see. The Chartist movement is another major movement in England at this time. Remember, the Chartist movement's the closest that England ever gets to a French Revolutionary style economic revolution, where the Chartists were seeking political democracy. They had 6 demands that they were looking for. Ultimately, all but one of them is met. This could have included the 6 demands of the Chartists included, what were they? Now I gotta rack my brain here. Okay, so one of them, the one that doesn't pass, is annual elections. That's the one that never really gets put into place. But secret ballot is one of them. Widening the franchise, universal male suffrage is another one, and so on. And so you have, I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. They might be even in here. I don't know. No, I think it's a little bit later that the Chartists are talked about. But anyhow, we do see eventually. But remember, the Chartist movement itself is a failure. They did not, in their time, manage to get the People's Petition, which is the large document that they had signed, passed by Parliament. Child labor was a major factor of the Industrial Revolution as well. There was a lot of reasons for increased child labor, but mostly it's like basically you can pay them less, and kids, they don't really know any better. They're small. They can fit in between the cracks and crevices of the machine. A lot of times, because they didn't have compulsory education quite yet, although that is going to be introduced, in the 19th century, you'd rather have kids working in factories than out causing trouble in the streets. Now, of course, eventually child labor gets outlawed, particularly in things like mines and other things like that, where the work for children was just deemed to be too dangerous. And really it is. I mean, if you think about coal mining is even today in modern times, 2020, coal mining is an extremely dangerous job. And we see coal, mine explosions and people getting trapped in mines and other things like that, which have been in the news in recent years. Now, abandoned children often became a main source of labor from local parishes and orphanages. And the children were treated very harshly. Remember back in this time, that when you raised kids, a lot of times these kids were raised almost as though they were just like miniature adults. So there was no like there was very little pity taken on children in the sense that like they didn't have an understanding that like your prefrontal cortex continues to develop till you're 25 years old or anything like that. So when kids were treated, the way kids were treated in this time was extremely severe, and they had been doing work for a long time, so it wasn't really new to force your kids to work, because one of the reasons that people had huge families out in rural areas is so that they could have more labor on the farms that they were working on and stuff like that. Families often came in the early days to work in the mills as full family units, but increasingly as time goes on, we see that women and children are replaced by men in factories. So remember that in the early days, actually, factories were an opportunity for women and children who I hate to say opportunity, because it's not, they're being exploited so badly, it's not that big of an opportunity, but it was pitched to women in particular in the early days that working in a factory was a labor opportunity for them to supplement their income, particularly if they were, one of 3 or 4 daughters in their family and there was no dowry left over, because women in this time, their number one opportunity was actually getting married. And so if it seemed like your opportunity to get married was slim, you might try and go and supplement your income to save up enough money, or even just have an opportunity to meet, say, a man. And remember, there was a lot of religious aspects, in particular in America, to these factories, where women would be required to go to church on Sunday and other things like that. And perhaps there you might meet, a man of your same social caliber that you could potentially enter into marriage with. We see the roles of cities change in the 19th century. From basically previous to this, cities were known as governmental and cultural centers to now being industrial centers. And in England, the big ones are going to be Manchester, Leeds, London, of course, industrializes, amongst other places. But workers began to unite for political action to remedy their dissatisfaction, and reformers sought to improve the life in cities by the time that we get to about the 1850s, and the conditions are so abysmal that something has to be done, because it's just getting so awful by the mid-19th century. Working class injustices, gender exploitation, and standard of living issues definitely became the 19th century's great social and political dilemmas that Parliament, in particular in England, had to deal with, but also in other places as well. Family structure and gender roles within the family also changed. Families as an economic unit were no longer the chief unit of both production and consumption. We see people working in wage labor, and roles of women change as time moves on. Productive work is taken out of the home and put into factories. And as factory wages for skilled adult males rose, women and children were separated from the workplace. Gender determined roles at home and domestic life start to emerge slowly by this time. Married women come to be associated with domestic duties, while men tend to be the sole wage earner for the family. Single women and widows definitely had a lot of work available, but in the early days, but that work commanded very low wages and very low skills, and provided really no way to protect themselves from exploitation. Irish workers, thanks to the potato famine of the 1830s, the Irish workers increasingly start migrating out of Ireland to especially America, to be honest with you, but they also did come to England. But overpopulation and rural poverty were most severe in Ireland, because they don't industrialize in the 19th century. And it's funny, because when we say that the pond and the stone in the pond of England for industrialization, for some reason England is able to treat, well, not for some reason, for a good reason, Ireland is essentially a colony of Britain at that time. And so Britain, having such a degree of military and political control over Ireland, prevents Ireland from being able to industrialize. But also the potato famine complicates things there, and there's a huge downturn in the economy in Ireland in the time where everybody else is industrializing. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to the end of reviewing Industrial Revolution. At this time, I will swap back over here to me. Any questions before I turn you guys loose for today? That's about an hour and 20 minutes of instruction. Give you a few minutes if you have any questions. All right. Well, if there are no questions, then I will leave it there for today. I'll make sure to update the online, the Schoology lessons, that pink lessons folder. I'll make sure to put up a lesson for you guys today, an assignment that you guys can do to review some of this stuff. I'll make that available to you by noon today. At this time, I will be signing off, and I got to get my stuff set up for teaching regular world, and we'll be talking about the tail end of World War II in regular world history. So I will sign off. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today, and we'll see you back here on Wednesday. Take care, everybody.